Okay. Okay. Oh, where's my microphone? Right there. Okay. All righty. All right. So, on the agenda for today is, keep talking about religion pretty much 100%. I think this is going to be our last topic. It is 100%. We're going to end with religion. Won't have time to do a whole unit on mass media, I don't think, because we're not going to be done this today. We'll probably be done Monday, early Wednesday. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so we ended off, we're talking about religion. So we're going to keep talking about religion, and specifically today, we are going to look at, some of these classical understandings again, especially Weber's, and then look at some more contemporary theories of religion, specifically one that's called market theory. Okay, so we ended off here, right, this functionalist view of religion, which again, comes from our buddy Emil Durkheim. And Durkheim, right, had this kind of sense. What does religion do? It bonds people together. It creates collective experiences, makes them feel nice, right? That's collective effervescence, the bubbly feeling you get at a rock concert when everybody's doing the same thing. And he thinks everything is just a psychological state or a function of society. There's nothing inherent about religion that's true, right? He's an atheist at its core. Okay. So Durkheim on religious change. So basically, like a lot of the scholars in this period, so this is true of Marx, this is true of Weber as well, essentially Durkheim believed that traditional religion was in decline and that it would eventually, sometime in the reasonably foreseeable future, disappear. So this is sometimes, I'll talk about it a little bit later, referred to as the secularization thesis. Secularization, right? Or the idea that eventually, we would end up in a secular society, one in which there is no religion, right? Where religion has basically been abandoned. Okay, so he thought, as we progressed away from the medieval village in particular, where we were bonded closely to other people, as we experienced more of what he called anomie, right? This feeling of detachment from the others in society, religion would disappear because it was no longer serving its social purpose, right? So always think of functionalists, right? Institutions serve a social purpose. They do something specific in society. For Durkheim, religion was about giving people shared morals and values and bonding them together as communities. And when you get into mass society, right, when people leave the medieval village and go to the city, it obviously can't serve that function anymore because people aren't so closely connected. So he thought, we would basically get the cult of the individual, that as religion retreated, we would become more and more focused on ourselves as people. And yeah, medieval society was about the village, the common good, the good of the group. It was disrupted by capitalism, and people, starting with capitalism, start to see themselves more as individuals. So, Durkheim, in a sense, while he's not a religious person, he also views this as a sort of catastrophe, right? And in a lot of ways, kind of like Friedrich Nietzsche, right? That Friedrich Nietzsche is a philosopher, but he was the one that sort of declared the death of God, which he saw as a sort of catastrophe, like a social catastrophe. Basically, Durkheim sees it in a similar way. And he says, if individualism is left unchecked, right, if there's no system to bring people together, you would get the disintegration of a smooth functioning society. Okay. If you want kind of a contemporary sort of take on this, though, I don't think he would admit that he's Durkheimian in his orientation or functionalist. Because I like to listen to lots of different things. One of the people I listen to on a regular basis is Ben Shapiro, And he was making exactly this argument, I think either yesterday or a couple of days ago on his podcast. But basically, right, religion is about morals and values, and it checks individualism. If individualism is left unchecked, you're going to get social dissolution. So we still see this kind of argument kicking around, even though, like I said, I don't think, given the very mean things Ben Shapiro has said about sociologists, apparently we're not an expert discipline. I doubt that he would name check Durkheim, but he is checking the kind of concept. Okay, so some flaws in Durkheim's definition, right? As I said, he's a little bit vague with his terms, the sacred and the profane. He doesn't give a lot of detail on what they are, right? The concept of church is added to the concept of the sacred, right? So a church and a system of beliefs, and to a system of beliefs to differentiate religion from magic, right? So Durkheim wants to delineate religion from magic. So he thinks magic is perfectly compatible with, modern society, but he thinks religion isn't, because magic exists at the individual level and religion has to be done communally. But yeah, he's really bad at his definitions, and it's, I think, a constant critique of Durkheim. And yeah, he does not include supernatural or what you might call, what Christian Smith calls superhuman powers in his definition. And he thinks there are primitive religions that lacked any kind of reference to the supernatural. And I think more modern definitions kind of reject this, right? That religion, if you don't have some kind of supernatural element to it, it becomes indistinguishable from other forces like nationalism. And yeah, he makes some basic mistakes. He believes Buddhism lacked reference to the supernatural, which is incorrect. Some forms of Buddhism do, but Buddhism, having split off from Hinduism, in a lot of cases still carries a lot of Hindu kind of theological assumptions. But that's, in detail. I don't know what this means. This here. I'm just going to leave it. Take it off. Okay, so Weber. So that here we're into our friends, the symbolic interactionists. Right? Right, so our symbolic interactionists. And, Weber is one of these sort of confusing figures in that sometimes he is clumped in with the conflict theorists, other times he is considered a symbolic interactionist. When it comes to religion, Weber is very much a symbolic interactionist. And one of the really key things about Weber, right, is one of the reasons that he is not classed in with, say, conflict theorists is that he has a big stress on the ways religion, or specifically how concepts in religion are understood, can ultimately lead to social change. And the most famous book on this is a very, very famous, and if you go on to say, take classical social theory, so I think it's SOC 235, typically taught by Richard Westerman, great guy. He has a British accent. He sounds very smart. He's a great guy. He really is very smart. He just doesn't sound it. But he wrote this book, Weber wrote this book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And basically what he tries to do in this book is link the development, the change from medieval feudal society to kind of modern capitalist society to find its origins in the Protestant Reformation, and specifically what he calls the Protestant ethic, right? Okay, you play this little video, and I will, hopefully this isn't going to play in my headphone. It is, hang on. I forgot to charge my mic, and so I'm using my headphone to stream the audio. That might mean I have to quickly change the output on my, I hope that works.
Those who pursue religion often turn away from worldly affairs. They're suspicious of wealth and business, preferring an ascetic life of contemplation and prayer. The sociologist and economist Max Weber argued that after the Reformation, one form of Christian Protestantism, Calvinism, encouraged a different attitude to work, with far-reaching effects. Calvinists believed in predestination. A precise number of souls would go to heaven. The lucky ones had places reserved by God. However, most Calvinists were terrified there would be no seat awaiting them in paradise. They were always on the lookout for signs that they had been saved. One clear indication that they were on the guest list was that they were actively contributing to their community through their work. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the Calvinists' need to reassure themselves through their industry was an important factor in the growth of capitalism in Northern Europe. They built up businesses that generated wealth, but at the same time lived thrifty lives. They reinvested any surplus and so helped fuel capitalism. Eventually, capitalism would have a life and momentum of its own, but according to Weber at least, its initial impetus came from a theological source.
Oh, sorry. The mic is still, I can't fix everything. And usually if my microphone's on, it will filter that out. But sadly, you can download the slides and watch the video separately. Sorry, online friends. My bad. Okay, so I guess I want to say a couple more words about the Protestant ethic that's important. So one of the things, right, and you kind of see what's being argued in that video is the following, right? So basically, Protestants, right? So Protestantism emerges in 1517, right? The Protestant Reformation begins in 1517, and it transforms the life of Europe in fundamental ways, right? What you had prior to that was a continent that was dominated by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church had a specific way of understanding salvation, right? And salvation was through the sacraments, right? Which are like communion, confession, and those were administered by the church. So how you got to heaven, right? How you gained salvation was by believing in Jesus and doing what the church told you, which was, going to mass, taking communion, getting confession, there's 7 sacraments, we won't go into it all, and that's how you got salvation. Protestantism does away with the Catholic Church in some ways, right? Protestants don't believe in the authority of the Catholic Church. So they fundamentally rethink this idea of salvation. How do you get to heaven? And this one particular cat, right, or person, his name is John Calvin, right? So John Calvin, I'll write it on the slides. John Calvin, he founds what's called Calvinism. And Calvinism's idea of salvation is that there is a group of what he calls the elect, right? The elect, which are people that were chosen by God before the universe was made to go to heaven, right? So basically, you can't do anything, right? There is no way for you to get to heaven by any particular actions, right? Because God either picked you or didn't pick you to go to heaven at the beginning of time, right? Or before the universe was even born. God knew everything and he picked who was going and who wasn't. So this causes a lot of existential angst, right? People are worried that they are potentially going to not go to heaven. They're going to go to the bad place, right? And so they start to try and figure out, okay, what does it look like to be elect? Like, what do the elect look like? And so according to Weber, they do things like they work really hard, right? It's like, okay, the elect are clearly the ones that are doing well materially, right? Because those are the people God's blessed. All right, so they're going to do really well. They're going to, live frugal lives because that's what the Bible says, right? So those are the people who are, they're doing well economically. They're contributing to the communities through work. They're growing things. They live frugal lives. And because then they have, a bunch of money left over because they're making lots through their work, but they're not spending lots, they can reinvest that in their businesses. And what Weber says is that's the thing that sparks off capitalism. So why capitalism takes off in the Netherlands and England, he says, is because those are Protestant countries that have this Protestant ethic. Okay, so hang on. I'm going to clear my doodles quickly because I have something else to tell you on this. So this book is very famous. Very, very famous. It's still taught in sociology departments. And I do want to say it's spectacularly wrong. So Weber's whole thesis, right, it's really interesting, and it's a great illustration of this idea in symbolic interactions of how religion can lead to social change. It does all of those things really well, but on the facts, it's wrong, right? So I'm not, and I say this only, because so you don't do what I did after I read it and had my, back when I was doing my undergrad, start walking around and be like, the Protestant ethic, the Protestant ethic, the Protestant. I'm going to spare you all of that. Weber's wrong about his thesis. So one of the things we know is that proto-capitalism emerges much, much earlier than the Protestant ethic, and it doesn't emerge in England or the Netherlands. It emerges in Italy, and specifically in Italian city-states like Venice, but more specifically Milan. And it emerges in a lot of cases from Roman Catholics, and especially, and Rodney Stark, who's another sociologist of religion, he hates Weber. He derisively says in one of his books, How the West Won, that Weber's book has a thesis so stupid that only sociologists could believe it. And being a sociologist himself, I take his criticism for what it is. But basically that, capitalism actually finds a much earlier origin in Italian city-states. It is related for Stark to Christianity, just not the Protestant ethic, right? It emerges from Catholic monasteries and Italian Catholic city-states, which then, the Protestant countries of Northern Europe sort of, are lucky in some ways. They also have, a particular emphasis on some of these things, not, he thinks, related to Protestantism, but Weber's thesis that basically capitalism is sort of antithetical to Catholicism, but it works really well with Protestantism is historically wrong. But the interesting argument that he makes paves the way for us being able to look at how we change our understanding of a religious concept like salvation that can potentially change the way we organize our societies. Okay, we won't play that again. Super fun as it is. Okay, so rationalization, and I will say here secularization again, because Weber's also a secularization believer. And basically, he believed that capitalism and modernity would lead to the rationalization of everyday life, right? So we talked about this earlier in the course, that everything in society starts to be organized in as efficient a way as possible under capitalism, right? So that we get the max, maybe not a very human way, right? You've got the iron cage of bureaucracy, as Weber calls it, right? But everything is organized to be as efficient as possible, right? We send our kids to school from 7 or 8 o'clock to 3:30 in the afternoon, not because teenagers do particularly well at those hours, but because we're working and it makes sense. It's the most rational and efficient way of doing things. And basically, Weber thought that this kind of rationalization, efficiency, science, bureaucracy would basically, come to dominate modern societies, and that fundamentally would leave no space for religion. And specifically, right, he thought that rationalization, and especially the scientific investigation, pardon me, hiccup, the scientific investigation of everything, right, would lead to what he called disenchantment, right? And what he says is basically like pre-modern societies, there were spirits, there were ghosts, there were supernatural powers everywhere, right? Everything could be explained by some kind of supernatural process. But as we rationalized, and especially as science became more the predominant way of seeing things, we would come to materialist explanations, right? Why is there lightning? And I'm being glib. I know religious people don't believe this, but let's, just say why is there lightning? It's not because God is angry. It's because, there's friction in the clouds and it causes an electrical discharge, right? We would start to explain everything, the creation of the world by evolution by natural selection, or not creation of the world, the origin of life, right, as evolution by natural selection. And essentially, Weber's belief was that religion would become unnecessary and disappear, right? And I mean, Weber is sort of agnostic on this. Like, unlike Durkheim, he doesn't see this as particularly bad. He sees it as just basically inevitable. The function of science and rationalization would be secularization. Sure, sometimes things overlap. It happens. So we covered that at the beginning of the course, for sure. Okay, so one of the other famous figures in kind of symbolic interactionism is this guy. So he starts his work in about the 1960s, so he's considerably more contemporary. And he dies, I want to say Berger dies in 2003, right? 2002, 2003, I can't remember exactly which. And he's famous for his thesis on the social construction of reality. And basically, right, what is social construction? Humans in their social world exist in a kind of back and forth dialectic relationship. Society is a product of human beings, right? We make society, but we're also produced by society. So basically, it's both a product, society is both a product of our inventiveness, and we are shaped by it, and our understanding of the world is shaped by it. And this includes religion, right? For Berger, religion is also functionally, it comes out of our human imagination, but it also shapes us in profound ways. So, yeah, we live in a world of our own making, according to Berger. He calls this we live under a sacred canopy, especially when we're religious, right? Religion is part of this, but it also helps us make sense of the world. But what Berger says generally, people actually don't care about religion that much, right? Historically, people are more focused on the here and now, right? They're worried about, in contemporary, buying a house, making the bills, getting good grades, right? They're focused on the here and now rather than the supernatural or what we call the existential, right? Or the afterlife or whatever. But what happens now and then for Berger, even though you're probably more focused on the here and now, the ordinary is ruptured, right? You remember a dream, right? Something that you can't shake. Some powerful experience of nature can provoke a deep existential question. And I remember a student, I presented this in class, and a student came up to me afterwards, and they were like, yeah, this one right here, I experienced that. They were like, I was in Thailand, and I was out at night, and there was a full moon. It was rising over a temple, and I saw this beautiful full moon, in the sky, and I was like, why is that? Like, is there something rather than nothing? Like, why is there something rather than nothing? Why are we here? Why is the world beautiful, right? Could it all just be a random accident, right? So occasionally these kinds of experiences put things into focus. And also death, right? Either the fear of your own death or the death of someone you care about puts life into focus, right? Puts questions of morality and this kind of business and some of our business as usual stuff on the back burner while we try to make sense of losing someone we care about or facing your own death. And this sometimes brings religion into everyday experience. Okay, so what Berger says is religion offers what he calls a sacred canopy, right? So do I have this on the? Oh, he died. I didn't think he died that late. Maybe he did. I could be wrong. Okay, I don't have my sacred canopy drawing, right? So he says, society is like here, and religion offers a kind of like a roof on top of society, which he calls the sacred canopy, right? And what he says is most of life, society. He says most of life is pretty precarious, right? People are dying, bad things are happening, Putin invades Ukraine, right? Things seem pretty at risk, and your life is maybe in danger, things are falling apart. Justin Trudeau raises the carbon tax on you and you can't afford to drive your car, right? There's a precarity to life, right? But religion, he says, so everything's precarious and transitory. We see people dying, we see things falling apart. Society's kind of falling apart. Religion, Berger says, gives a sort of semblance of ultimate security. It gives a story that we can latch onto that tells us this is the meaning of things, right? And that actually that precarity is not, you might perceive it, but actually there's a bigger plan or a cosmic order that is actually quite secure. And he calls that, the sacred canopy. So, religion gives meaning to the social world by giving it a sense of the sacred, right? Why are we here? Because God wants us here, or some such thing. So, for Berger, religion is essential in that function because it helps make things livable and it makes reality intelligible, right? So it makes reality understandable. Otherwise, and Nietzsche sort of talks about this as well, without religion, right, we can slip into a sort of nihilism, right? And so write that. Nihilism, right? Or a sense, nihilism. A sense that there is no meaning, that everything is just chaos and disorder, and it can be really hard for human beings to live in that world. Religion makes the world understandable, right? It gives order to reality, right? Why did this happen? Because, of sin, right? Or whatever the explanation is that religion offers, or because of attachment, right? Why are you suffering? If you're Buddhist, well, it's because of your attachments, right? Why are you suffering? If you're Catholic, it's because of sin, right? Why are you, and you can go on, and I won't, because, it's not a comparative religion kind of thing, but it protects us from a sort of existential nihilism. Okay. Oh, I'm sad now, Peter. Peter, I loved you. All right. So, what am I doing for time? I'm doing good. All right. So, more contemporary theory of religion. So, this is probably one of the most famous ones. This is Rodney Stark. Just died a few years ago. And like I said, he's sort of my hero and my spirit animal because he's a jerk and I love him. I guess I'm not a jerk, but I would love to be sometimes. So, Rodney Stark and Lawrence, so this is his buddy, Lawrence Anacone, they come up with this theory of how religion works called market theory. And market theory is probably, I'll tell you a little bit about Rodney Stark. He is a really exceptional figure because basically before Stark, more or less, everybody kind of agrees in sociology of religion on a couple of things. A, that secularization is happening and it's inevitable, right? That the world is going to become less religious until religion is basically gone. And that, religion it's more or less in that sort of Marxist conception or that kind of socially constructed Berger conception, that it's there, it serves our functions, even, in a functional sense, it's created by us to serve us, and it works mostly on deprivation, right? Because it kind of serves a social purpose. And Stark comes along in the 1960s, right? And he's a grad student. And Stark is a particularly brilliant person, right? And by the time so this never happens, by the way. By the time he graduates from his PhD, he is so prominent and well known that he's hired at University of Washington in Seattle and immediately promoted to full professor, right? So usually you have to go through like 3 stages. You're an assistant professor for 5 years, and then you go, as an associate professor, and it could be your whole career, but at least 5 to 10 years as an associate, and then you get promoted to full professor, at which point you can basically flip the bird to all your colleagues because you've hit the highest point you can, you have tenure, and you don't have to worry about anyone getting in the way of your promotion anymore and being like, I don't like this fellow, he shouldn't get promoted to associate or full professor. And Stark gets promoted to full professor right away, like right out of his PhD. And in Stark's own retelling of his life, he's like, I got promoted to full professor, so I didn't have to play the game of kind of supporting everybody's bad ideas and talking about how Durkheim had all this to say. And so he completely flips sociology of religion on its head. And it takes a little while, right? His first kind of attempts at coming up with a theory of how religion works are called rational choice theories, in which he posits that, people choose religion for rational reasons. But the theory that really changes people's understanding of how religion works is this one. It's market theory. or the theory of religious economies. And basically, what Stark says, Stark, and he works with a few people, William Bainbridge, Lawrence Iannacone, both of whom are economists, and basically comes up with this idea that religion operates fundamentally the same way an economy operates, and it operates on supply and demand. So, one of the things that religious economy does, right? So, if we think of something like Marx's deprivation theory, right? This theory that people want religion because their lives suck so much and they need something to assuage that. That fundamentally is a sort of, in economics terms, it's a demand side theory, right? Why do people need religion? Well, they need religion because of a certain demand in their lives. And religious economies or market theory shifts it fundamentally to a supply side theory. What is it that religions do that gets people to be religious, right? So what is it that they're supplying that then consumers sort of want? And there's reasons that this is really important. One of them is that very famously, there's this 400-year tradition of people, philosophers and sociologists all predicting that essentially religion's demise was just around the corner, right? Thomas Jefferson, the American founding father, famously predicted in the 1780s that within 50 years, Christianity would disappear and all there would be was, he thought Unitarian Universalists. Peter Berger, in The Sacred Canopy, suggests that by the year 2000, basically the few remaining religious believers on earth would be huddled together in isolated communities, basically trying to shield themselves from the coming of the global secular order, right? There would only be a few religious people left on earth. And this doesn't happen. And part of the reason is everybody is focused on the demand side of religion, right? They're focused on why would people want to be religious? Well, it must be because their lives suck and they need Jesus to make them feel better or like they're going to get into heaven. And as material conditions improve, right, as we create better technologies, better healthcare, all of those things, no one should need to be religious anymore. And that doesn't happen, right? There's still religious people around. The United States especially defies the expectations that modernity, right, getting more modern, leads to, can you tell I love this topic and I teach a whole class on it? Modernity ultimately leads to a decline in religion. And America, right into the early 2000s, remains incredibly religious, even as a modern society. It sort of defies expectations. So we need a new theory to kind of explain it. So religious economies is what Stark and Iannacone come up with to explain this. Okay, do I have like a question slide here somewhere? I just want to make sure because that was a long preamble. Okay, so basically what they say is the religious economy is like any economy, right? And you have current or potential customers for religion, right? People who might be in search of a religious product. And then you have a whole bunch of religious firms, right? And whoops, did not mean to go forward. I just wanted my highlighter, right? Religious firms, right? That are looking to provide product lines, right? Different kinds of religious product. And so think about Edmonton as a sort of religious market, right? Drive down any particular area of the city, right? I'm thinking 99th Street, and eventually you're going to pass a whole bunch of different churches, maybe a synagogue, maybe a temple, maybe a mosque or whatever it happens to be, right? So there's different and you're going to have a Catholic church, a Lutheran church, a Pentecostal church, right? You might have a Orthodox Jewish synagogue, a Reformed Jewish synagogue. You're going to have a whole bunch of different kind of products on offer that a religious person could potentially consume. So we think of it that way, right? There are religious products being offered, and there are potential religious consumers. So basically, instead of asking, what we think people need when they turn to religion, we ask more with religious economies, under what conditions are religious firms able to create demand? So what Stark and his kind of cohort do with market theory is they suggest that there's essentially two kinds of religious marketplaces. There are religious free markets, and there's religious monopolies, right? So in a religiously free market, essentially, people can essentially do whatever they want. Anyone is free to set up a religious firm, right, that can offer a different religious product. Whereas in a religious, and the state plays very little role. In a religious monopoly, the state essentially chooses one or a small set of religions, and those are the only ones that are allowed to offer a religious product. So basically, if a religious economy is unregulated, if you have a religious free market, it will tend to be pretty pluralistic, right? There's going to be a lot of religious firms active in the market. If it's a monopoly, you're going to have very few. So, pluralism, weirdly, inhibits new religious firms from gaining market share. So, if you are a new religious firm and you want to gain market share, right, a new religious movement or a sect or whatever, you have to work really, really hard. And you really have to find a niche that is going to attract people. Okay. Now, on the other side, right? Well, you might think that a religious monopoly where there's only one product, right? Let's say, like, through a lot of European history, right, you only had the Catholic Church or you only had Protestant churches, right? You know, if you're in parts of Germany, you've been Lutheran. If you were in France, you would have been Catholic, and that was the only church. What Stark suggests is that actually religious regulation and monopolies don't create really powerful religions. You know, we tend to think of the medieval church in Europe as really powerful and really dynamic. But actually, what Stark says conversely is that it was really lethargic. The church got really, really lazy in the Middle Ages, right? After it was established as the official religion of the Roman Empire, it went from a very dynamic religion that was always trying to push the boundaries to one where the clergy were paid by the state, and suddenly they didn't have a lot of motivation to go out and find new believers, right? They were secure. The church itself was sort of secure, and they got kind of lazy. So when we look at, and this is always the big question in market theory, why are America and Europe so different? Right? America is very religious by modern standards. And Europe is very secular, right? Very non-religious. Despite having a lot of cool churches and a long history, right? When you look at the actual figures, Europe is not very religious. So why would a very modern country like the United States be so different from very modern countries in Europe, right? Clearly modernity, science and all that jazz can't be the story. So for Stark, it's this, right? And if you know the American Constitution a little bit, right, the First Amendment bars the establishment of an official religion by the US government, which has meant that the US functionally has always been a religious free market. And so what you get is a very vital religious landscape where, you know what, if you're going to a church and you're not happy with it, right, you find that pastor is boring or that priest is boring, you don't like the music, whatever it happens to be, there's 100 other churches you can go to, which means rather than you just staying home on Sunday morning or Friday or Saturday or whenever you go to your religious services, you're free to go shop for another one that suits you better. And, as opposed to sort of a one size fits all economy, right, where it's like, well, if you don't like Catholicism, you stay home, which is more what Europe has been historically. In the US, you just walk down the street, you find a different place to go that better suits your personal inclinations, and so you're more likely to remain religiously engaged, right? This is also why America has been an absolute hotbed of new religious movements, and some of the more kind of recent new religious movements that we see having emerged and become kind of proper religions, things like Seventh-day Adventists and Mormons, right, or Latter-day Saints as they prefer to be called, emerged from the United States. there've been very few successful new religious movements launched out of continental Europe because it has been, and in a lot of ways continues to be, a religious monopoly. Okay, so how am I doing for time? Super good. And I'll just say, right, this is more of kind of the same thing. Do I have no questions? Perfect. You can think of it like this, and this is a metaphor that Stark uses. That Europe is more like a town with a single fast food restaurant, right? Let's say you're in some kind of rural Alberta town, and there's no restaurants, and McDonald's moves in, right? Now, a certain number of people are going to be attracted by McDonald's, right? They're going to be like, oh yeah, I want a cheeseburger and fries, and they're going to go and get it. But demand is never going to be, the restaurant industry in your town is never going to be super vibrant because there's only one option, right? So people who don't like McDonald's are not going to go. However, if your town suddenly has 20 restaurants offering, you've got a burger joint, you've got a pizza joint, you've got a Vietnamese restaurant, you've got Thai food, you've got Chinese food, an Italian place, all of a sudden the actual total consumption of restaurant products is going to rise because there's something for everyone, right? Anyone who's hungry and doesn't want to cook is going to find some product out there that they like. So what Stark suggests, as opposed to the secularization thesis, which we'll talk about, which says religion is going to die off, basically says a serious decline in religion should be unlikely as long as the religious marketplace is unregulated, right? As long as, if market conditions change and people aren't digging, mega evangelical mega churches with rock bands, eventually someone is going to come into that marketplace, create a religion that does appeal to people who didn't like that, and you're going to get a sort of spontaneous kind of revival of religion over time, right? That religion is going to keep finding new ways to attract people as long as the market is basically unregulated. Okay, so that's market theory. Okay, so got 5 more minutes. Let's talk a little bit about secularization. We'll pick this up on Monday for sure. Okay, so secularization. So secularization basically is the idea that religious institutions, actions, and consciousness are on the decline worldwide. And fundamentally, it is because of, it's caused by modernization, right? It's the leading cause for most people who believe in secularization is modernization, and specifically, scientific and other forms of rationalism replacing religious authority, right? So, and again, this is Weber, and I just talked about it. In medieval and early modern Europe, church, right? The church, whether it was Catholic or Protestant, was at the center of life, both spiritually, but also in the worldly sense, right? Like the gathering place for communities was the church, right? The church was the center of community life. But, following, we talked about it at the beginning of the course, right? The scientific revolution and the Industrial Revolution, a lot of this changes, right? People move out of the medieval town, right? Medieval towns kind of start to shrivel and die. They're replaced by these large, relatively anonymous, anomic kind of cities where people don't know their neighbors. They're not deeply connected to communities. And the living conditions aren't particularly harsh. And, so the scientific, in terms of changes in worldview, and the industrial in terms of the breakdown of social bonds leads to secularization, right? And both the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, in some senses, are the foundations of modernization, right? So, Weber, Durkheim, Marx, Comte, Peter Berger, and just about everybody until the 1960s are all what we call secularization theorists, right? And all of the theories of religion are all secularization theories that say this is how religion worked, this is why it worked for people in primitive societies, and this is why it's going to stop working in the future. Okay, 2 minutes. I'll just introduce this and then we'll just touch on it again on Monday. By the 21st century, the beginning of the 21st century, the end of the 20th century, it's pretty clear that this kind of classical secularization theory is not going to pan out. And I told you, about Peter Berger, who said that, by 2000 there'd only be a few religious people left in the world. Well, very famously in 1998, right? Peter Berger writes a paper where he basically says, to put it in religious terms, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, or I was wrong, right? We misunderstood the nature of religion and secularization to a great extent. And what happens then is, in order to sort of try and salvage the concept of secularization, people try to revise it, right? To figure out, okay, we still know that modern societies are different than medieval societies, especially, and that religion plays a different role today than it did in the past, but we don't know exactly how. And so they start trying to think this through. So they start revising the secularization thesis. And I'll talk about this next time as we careen wildly towards the end of the course. All right, we'll see you on Monday. Will I have office hours next week? Very limited. Email me if you want office hours. Alrighty.